to another Daily Stew. We're the Right Stew podcast. I'm Paul Stewart.
I'm Brian Wright again.
Still Brian Wright. There he is. And so Brian and I are both ACC honks. We're ACC homers. Brian went to NC State. I grew up in ACC country here. Loved the longtime Duke and Carolina and NC State and Wake Forest and Clemson, all these rivalries, and Virginia and all these schools. And the ACC has obviously expanded over the past 15, 20 years, adding Virginia Tech and Miami and Syracuse and Pitt and now SMU and Cal. And it's something that we didn't grow up with. But one of the big things every year is they used to do the ACC Big Ten Challenge, which is always a lot of fun. I had during our baseball playing days, I had a bunch of buddies who were kind of Midwest, and I'd always talk trash about how we stomped them. But now we're playing another conference from the South. So the SEC, traditionally the ACC has been the best conference in basketball, hands down, realistically, no argument.
I think maybe Paulie has changed over the last few years, and I think today, this past little week or a few days of competition has really showed a dominance. Right? It's different than I feel like in the Big Ten, it was usually there were one or two better, but I think the overall indication is this is going to have pretty big indications for how valuable your in-conference wins are, right, going forward. And so, and maybe it shouldn't. We're in December, right, and everybody's trying to get to March. But this essentially is going to determine how valuable your win is over Virginia Tech, or how valuable your win is over North Carolina or Duke or whoever. And it's just crazy to think that we're in a day and age. And I guess the question is, Paulie, why do you think it got here? How did we get here to where we're just getting dominated by the football conference?
Well, so a couple things. So one, I'm not a doom and gloom. I'm not panicking right now. All right. As an ACC homer, if you look back, there was a similar narrative last year, but then there's a few teams in the Elite Eight, right? NC State, Carolina, Clemson, or Duke, Clemson. But SEC 14-2 though is a pretty sound thumping, right? And oddly enough, the SEC school that you should just hang your hat on is one of the schools that lost in Kentucky.
Right.
And the other one that lost was undefeated Auburn to a good Duke team. So that was really odd. But I think one of the big things is the SEC isn't hiding this, but they are not afraid to invest and spend money on their athletic programs. So traditionally, I think it's safe to say they're the best football conference for sure. Baseball,
they're probably best baseball, right? Especially the last handful of years.
Again, the ACC's right there with them, but they're depending on the year. And now basketball, I think they're saying, hey, there's money to be made here. Let's invest a little bit, and now they're getting better kids, more NIL money. And better coaches. Here's the other thing.
That's where I was going.
Here's the other thing. Yeah. So the ACC, this is the first year since 1981 that the ACC does not have a coach who has won a national title. So Roy Williams retired in 21, Coach K in 22, Jim Boeheim in 23, Tony Bennett retired just a few months ago. So 1981,
which was kind of odd.
Won in 82, right? So there's a new shift, and Hubert Davis is good. John Shire's been good. There's good coaches still, but there's a changing of the guard, and then the SEC is picking up some really good coaches. The Bruce Pearl's still there, and a lot of strong coaches. So I think money, transition of coaches. Those are two things that really, really jump out to me. I don't know. Are there other things you can think of?
No, I do think, money, surprisingly, and I don't guess it's surprisingly, but is, it is the clear indicator of what probably makes it. But you would think UNC can pay guys what need to get paid.
Yeah.
You would think there's a lot of universities, if you're not spending a ton of money on basketball on football, you would spend money on basketball. You got to spend money on something, right? They talked about doing a cap, but you got to spend money on something if you want to be relevant, because we've talked about, these schools that the increase of applications because football does well, which really makes no sense, right? Unless you're going there to play football, it doesn't make. But people want to be with winners.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't say panic. You originally said, "Hey, I'm not panicking," but the thing that is kind of disconcerting or concerning, the scores were not even close, right? I mean, there was a lot of 10, 15, 20-point scores, and you're like, man, how did we get to this point to where we're not? This looks like what the ACC used to be when they were playing the A-Sun or playing somebody that was a truly a mid-tier,
The
and
Metro.
now
Yeah.
the ACC essentially basketball feels like it's become a second-tier conference, and I do think it's money. I do think it's doesn't mean more, right? It just means more in the SEC, right? And so it looks like it does, right? Everywhere, And it's kind of it's bizarre to see such a shift of just dominance in all sports, right? It's one thing, hey, football, and honestly, you can almost debate the SEC maybe gets a little too much credit. Clearly, still the best conference, but maybe a little too much credit. But basketball now, 14-2. Obviously, even the games we won or the ACC won are close games. It's not like we're dominating anybody from the SEC. And again, I think you mentioned it. Money is some of it. Portal is some of it.
Yeah.
And then I think probably you hit on it as well. Coaching in basketball and in football and ultimately in all sports, but really those two sports, it can make such a huge difference. Huge difference. And so being able to push the right buttons, obviously being able to get the right guys in there is part of that, but being able to push the right buttons and push guys, obviously UConn's going to be there at the end because they've got the right coach. That's obviously not it's historically a really good school in UConn, but it's not somewhere that I necessarily want to live. Like if I could live in the South or live up there, they've done a really good job.
Another thing. I think neither school has a geographic advantage, right? Yeah, maybe a little warmer in the SEC compared to the ACC, but not. I mean,
no. There's nothing. The obvious low hanging answers you hit on them, right? Is money, which ultimately kind of correlates to how good the coaches you get, and eventually how good a players you get, and then eventually how much you win. But there's still a lot to happen. But it is a clear indication that the guard has shifted. The guard has shifted.
Yeah, but when you get to the March Madness and the selection show and the committee and all that, they start putting all the quadrant wins and quadrant losses and that sort of thing. And this, coming back to December, this will matter when they say, hey, they lost this game or they won this game, that sort of thing. And what this could eventually mean is maybe one or two less teams even in the tournament for the ACC, unfortunately.
100%. I mean, I think even though we got 17 in our league, you go to like 5 and 5 or 6, and you end up with the 5th or 6th seed being like the last 4 in or first or last 4 out, and all of a sudden you got 3 or 4 that are kind of guaranteed. And it's hard to argue though, right? I mean, you kind of have major, hey, this is what we are as a comp. It's one thing, right, if you're close to 500 or 2 or 3 games under 500 against the SEC, but that's not the case. But yeah, it's an interesting story to follow, and obviously we'll still be pulling for the ACC, but it's like being an NC State fan. Sometimes that's really hard to do. Really hard to do. It builds character. You're never arrogant or feel really good about any situation. But essentially where we are is the ACC is like pulling for NC State now. So it's
So it was all right. So to wrap it up, it was a thumping, but I'm gonna hold out. Let's revisit. We'll revisit this throughout the year, but let's really take a close look at as we get towards the end of March and seeing where teams are shaking out, and because that's the great thing about sports, right? So let's come back to it at the end of the year, at the end of March, when we're seeing really who's in the short rows, and I think
short hair.
Maybe it's a different story. And again, with basketball, and again the AC's been really top heavy, right? Duke and Carolina have carried a lot of it, but then you'll have your Wake Forest and Virginia and Maryland when they were in the ACC was really strong with Gary Williams. So you'll have teams. Florida State's been good, right? You'll have teams pop up and win or get to the Final Four or very late in the tournament. So you don't necessarily have to have all your teams there, but just get a couple there. So
right.
I'll be excited to see how it wraps up.
I love it, love it, love it.
Also, let's make sure. So we've got some stuff out there now. We've got our YouTube channel. We've got our Instagram. We're on all the pods, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio. So make sure you subscribe, listen, share. We appreciate it, and we'll catch you guys soon.
Go Pack. Out.